Welcome to Thursday, day 4 of TPI Aspen 2020. I'm Scott Wallsten, President and Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. Having plumbed the depths of privacy, antitrust and competition, and China, today we turn to broadband. The past 7 months in particular have highlighted the importance of broadband and the costs of not having it. Today we're going to look at broadband from several perspectives. Our first panel is on the digital divide, which is getting real attention beyond the usual telecom group. After that, we have a fireside chat with FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, led by CNBC's Brian Sullivan. Finally, later today, we have a discussion among current and former FCC commissioners about challenges facing the commission. We're using a service called Slido to take questions from the audience for live Q&A sessions. If you've been with us in Aspen in the past, or the past few days, you're familiar with it. To use it in a separate browser window or on your phone, go to Slido, sli.do. In the event code field, type TPI Aspen 2020. The moderators and panelists will see those questions. For lunch and happy hour, we hope you'll join us in Gathertown, the interactive 2D St. Regis in Aspen we've built. If you don't have your instructions on how to get there, please reach out to Jane Creel. Gathertown will be open all day. Now let's move on to discuss the digital divide. Okay, thank you all for joining us today as we move into our first panel on the digital divide. So the pandemic has tied us more tightly to technology and broadband in particular than ever before. For many of us, broadband has been a lifeline, if I might coin a phrase, to our families, our friends, entertainment, work, and school, but not everyone is online. Millions of poor and rural families do not have connections, exacerbating inequalities. This school year, for example, is likely to prevent nearly all students from learning as much as they would have in a normal year. But the difference in educational attainment between the haves and the have-nots is likely to dwarf anything we've seen in most of our lifetimes. As bad as the problem is here, it's far worse in much of the world. Just this week, the Washington Post had a story about distance learning in Peru, where much of the school-age population is learning via lessons broadcast on television and submitting assignments via text message. But this is not Peru, it's the United States in 2021. The share of low-income and rural people with broadband is increasing, but little if any evidence suggests that our public policies are helping increase that rate sufficiently. Some policies are moving in the right direction. Reverse auctions for universal service funds are a good step forward. This was a bipartisan and interdisciplinary achievement. The FCC's first reverse auction occurred during Chairman Janikowski's tenure. Chairman Wheeler continued the work, and Chairman Pai has kept the ball rolling with another, the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund, starting next week. But aside from those auctions, which, although a very important step, represent only a small share of the funds distributed, and we don't deserve many pats on the back. These advances exist in a sea of programs that remain beholden to entrenched interests, with little evidence that, aside from these auctions, the subsidies have made much difference. And the poor remain shortchanged relatively, with rural areas receiving multiples more subsidies and attention despite the larger problem facing poor people without service. So that's what this panel is going to talk about today. Why we're here, what are the key issues to focus on, what programs have worked and not worked, what should we be doing now, right now, and what should we be doing over the medium and longer terms, and also what other countries have done and what we might be able to learn from them. This is a great group of people here to discuss this. Let me introduce them briefly and we'll launch into discussion. So in alphabetical order, we have first Kelly Gillis, who is Associate Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development in Canada. Carrie Howes, Head of Regulatory at Opensignal. Larry Irving, Principal of the Irving Group. Judith Mariscal, Executive Director, Centro Latam Digital and Professor, Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas. And Greg Rosston, Director of the Public Policy Program at Stanford University, and Gordon Cain, Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Let me start with you, Larry. This year marks the 25th anniversary, I believe, of what I think is the very first report, your report, on the digital divide. So I'd like to start off by asking you where we are now compared to what you might have expected when you first wrote that report, what you got right, what you got wrong, what you wish we'd paid attention to and didn't, what you wish you'd known at the time. Kind of bring us up to speed on the digital divide.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for the invitation to participate. You know, looking back at 25 years, I would have bet any amount of money that we wouldn't be where we are today. I would not have bet that 5% of American rural families would not have access to broadband because they're not connected. And I certainly wouldn't have bet that we still have roughly 20% of American families that don't have access to real broadband because they can't afford it. We made some tactical errors. I want to focus more, when you look at a country as rich as ours, where fully 10 million children are out of school right now and have neither a computing device nor broadband access to their homes, that's unconscionable. And I spend a lot of time with universities. I'm a proud graduate of Stanford. I'm a proud graduate of Northwestern University. I'm a trustee at Northwestern. And the fact that universities like Northwestern and Stanford have to spend millions of dollars to connect some of their students as they're studying from home, I can't even get my arms around that. But when you think about what that must mean for community colleges and university and public universities, it's astounding. But let me get what we got right, what we got wrong. I think I got caught up in Teletopia. I believed we would solve this problem. I thought that where the market didn't respond, that we would make government policies that would. Unfortunately, the digital divide was politicized early on, and it's become more politicized, so that now some people think of digital divide just as rural. So people have gone to the respective corners instead of saying it's a national problem. The network effects work. We're all better off if every American is connected. There are folks saying, well, poor people, we don't want to spend a lot of another entitlement. We don't need that, but we have to do something for poor people. And I will say, some urban people say, well, why should I live in New York City and have to pay for some guy who decides to live on the prairie? That's his issue. We've not come together as Americans. I think a second issue that I want to go back on, if you look at the telephone network, I was involved in the development of Lifeline. Now, Lifeline's not working well. We need to rethink Lifeline. But here's what's important to remember about Lifeline. The 1934 Telecommunications Act existed for 50 years before we created a Lifeline. And in 1984, when we created a Lifeline, if you were Black, if you were brown, if you were Native American, you were 10 to 30% less likely to have a home telephone than if you were a suburban white household. So we've had this problem before. And the fact that I didn't recognize the same kind of forces that precluded us from really dealing with the fact that low-income people of color historically didn't have access to telephones might mean that going forward, fortunately, only 25 years into the internet revolution. And finally, let me go two other things that I think I made mistakes on. I made the mistake of thinking that wireless devices would be the answer to the problem of connectivity. It is a partial answer. I was part of the Obama transition team in 2008, 2009. I promoted a program that was not able to get funded, where we would take a look at how we would use the then new iPhone and the then not existent, but on the Launchpad iPad, and put $10 or $15 or $100 million into figuring out how we would use them as educational devices. I didn't get it funded, but think if we had 10 years of knowledge of how to use those devices for educational purposes today. Looking back, that was one mistake. But a second mistake that I made was I was also involved in the early mapping initiatives of both at NTIA and subsequently under BTOP with the Obama administration. Had we added affordability to mapping, I think we'd have a much clearer idea and a much clearer notion. The mapping exercise itself didn't work out, but I think if we'd added affordability included in that and access, the debate might have changed. We might be further along the path. I'm still optimistic we'll get there. It's just a lot slower than it should have been.
Wow, there's a lot in there that we'll have to unpack as we go along. Wireless and mapping data is one of my favorite topics. We'll get to all of those. Let me start actually with the politicization question. It seems like everything is more politicized these days, but is it? It seems like maybe the digital divide, is it possible that that's one of those things where there is somewhat more agreement on it? I mean, it used to be the case that it was hard to place an op-ed on the digital divide in a major paper because they thought most people weren't interested. And now it's hard to place one because everybody's writing about it. Do you think that at least this sort of new attention will create new incentives and for people of all beliefs to try to think about these problems now?
I'd like to say yes, but I have to say no. And the reason I have to say no is that even in the face of this pandemic, with literally trillions of dollars being spent, and all of us knowing that 1 out of 4 senior citizens who are most susceptible to this disease don't have broadband, even knowing that 10, 20% of our students can't do anything in school, haven't been in school for March because they don't have access to the internet or to computing devices. Not $1 of that $1 trillion has been focused specifically on the digital divide. Yes, some dollars have come out of DOE through CARES, but a focused attention on this, it hasn't happened even in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, and I don't want to be too partisan, but the FCC is spending as you noted, that has been $20 billion for 5% of the families that don't have rural access, and has done almost nothing to really address the pure poverty so many folks have, both economic poverty and technological poverty. And so, the politicization goes all the way back to the Gore tax for the E-rate. And we've moved this forward for 25 years. And I just tell folks, look, this isn't about Democrat, this isn't about Republican, this isn't about rural, this isn't about urban, not about Black or Latino or white. It's about how do we make sure that every American can access absolutely essential tools of engagement for education, for health, for commerce, for politics. And we're still not there. So yes, you can't place an op-ed, but you also can't get a bill passed that does anything about the problem.
That's a good point. Greg, so you've also been working on digital divide issues and universal service for a long time. Are there sort of big lessons that we should take away from our experience, things that we should be bringing to the table now to deal with these issues?
So I think Larry brings up a lot of important points, and Larry and I agree the goal of trying to connect everybody. We don't necessarily always agree on the ways of doing things. Larry came and spoke to my class last week, virtually came from sitting in that exact same seat, and he had a Stanford hat behind him over his shoulder, which he put after I berated him this morning. But in that class, the way I run it is that I let the speaker speak and I don't respond. So now I get a chance to
You never
respond.
run our conversations that way.
So no, I think we agree on things. And one of the important things that Larry brought up was this difference between rural universal service and low income. And I think these are two different problems. One is an affordability problem, one is an access problem. And we are spending billions, literally billions of dollars every year on the access problem for a small number of people. And we're not spending much money at all on low income programs where you might be able to connect a whole lot more people and a lot more people who can't afford it. And so I think this is something that's important. Scott, you and I wrote a paper recently looking at the Internet Essentials program. And we found one thing that was interesting, which is that affordability or price is not the only answer, because even if you lower the price a lot, not everybody is going to get on. There are other issues about people getting on. We don't know what the answers are. We've kind of found that digital literacy training isn't a great answer. But we don't know what is. And right now there's a huge experiment going on with school age kids that the FCC is completely ignoring, as far as I know, about how to get people online. School districts across the country, we probably have 10,000 different experiments because we have 10,000 different school districts. And let's try and figure out what worked and what didn't work in different school districts. So those are kinds of things that I think we should try and do. I do remain optimistic, although Kelly may disagree with me about wireless, as we had a wireless hotspot issue earlier this morning. But I think that, that over time, wireless has become better and better and better. When Larry first wrote the report, and I give Larry a ton of credit, in my class on writing and rhetoric, I say, how you title things matters. And titling it like an academic would have, the differential access of people to the internet would not have worked. But the digital divide, it's something that really resonates with people. So but when he wrote that 25 years ago, wireless was not internet access. You had a second telephone line going through AOL. And there was different things. It didn't matter as much in 25 years ago because life was not online all the time for people, and your government services weren't provided online. I have conversations with my doctor online. So these things matter, matter much more now. And so I think we do need to focus attention on where the problem is and getting the money. I teach cost benefit analysis. Let's try and put the money where we can make the most difference, which to me is where the most people are. The Willie Sutton theory.
I want to move on to Kelly, Ceri, and Judith in a second, but before I'd like to ask Larry to respond with particularly to the question of affordability and what we do now. So, like Greg said, we've done this work together, and we both agree that well, I guess I'm going to show my biases that that we've spent as a country, we've spent far too much attention on rural areas relative to poor people. But in the various experiments that the FCC has done and other projects like Internet Essentials, we see that you can bring the price pretty close to zero and people still don't subscribe. I mean, demand curves slope downwards, so lower prices are better. But what else do we need to focus on? And what should we be doing either in terms of studies right now or different approaches to try to learn what will best get low-income people online?
So first, let me agree that we spent, well, let me disagree a little bit and agree a little bit. I want to see every American connected. I don't know what the price tag should be for rural, but let's get those folks connected because they need to be connected. And, I have family from the rural South, and the folks who are really hurt are poor people of color in Southern and Southwestern America. They're really hurting because they're both poor and rural and Black or brown. And so I really want to make sure we do something there. So I'm not averse to doing something there, but we have overspent there, both in terms of resources and attention. With regard to poor people, one of the things that I learned when I wrote the Cable Act in 92, the Children's TV Act, is that poor people are just like every other consumer. They make informed choices based upon their lifestyle. One of the things I've learned from, I have families I'm from the projects. I've lived in the projects. I have family who live still in the projects. And they look at Internet Essentials and goes, it's lousy internet. It's 25.3. Some of these folks have jobs. They know what real internet is, and they don't believe that Internet Essentials is real internet. And people won't buy an inferior product. They like the same thing everybody else likes. So one of the things I've been pushing is let's rethink Lifeline. Let's give people vouchers or some other form of subsidy, and then let the marketplace fight for those dollars. Right now, Lifeline is $9.25, and with that, you can get bad cell phone, inadequate broadband, or maybe a telephone line to your home. If you made that $30 or $40, you'd be able to get folks who would say you can either have broadband or you can have a cell phone, or you can with more capacious, or you can get real broadband in your home. Verizon can provide 100 broadband over Fios in those areas where it exists. Internet Essentials is 25.3. I love Comcast as a company. That I have friends there, but 25.3 just isn't broadband. And 12 years ago, I was advocating for 100 standard for broadband in America. To offer somebody 25.3 and say, be happy with this, it's just not making sense. And so I think we could focus there. The other thing we could focus on is using the E-rate. Right now, if you have an E-rate money, you can't extend your broadband outside of the library or school. There is no reason why a school or a library couldn't stick an antenna on top of that building and radiate the neighborhood with some kind of a Wi-Fi-like signal or broadband signal using EBS or CBRS or other spectrum opportunities. We're really thinking hard about how to push ideas like that going forward. We need to be thoughtful, we need to give choice, and we need to give people real broadband. I think that'll help solve the problem.
Can I jump in for a sec, Scott?
Yes, please, Greg.
Which is, I just looked under the preferences. If you go to Zoom and look under your preferences, you can look at statistics. And right now, I'm using about 1 meg upload and 400 kilobits download. So, and I've got a pretty good screen and a pretty good setup. And so, I think we need to look at, it sounds great. 25.3 sounds like I can do a whole lot of Zoom calls in one. And it may be other things like the jitter or the latency or the reliability of your coverage, maybe not necessarily the speed. And so we need to look at other measures that are important to how it works. So I do agree with you that people look at the product, but the product may be okay.
It may be, but I don't know a family that I know who makes that choice, who would willingly take, including any of us, would take 25 years. We didn't have to. It's kind of like, I'm of the neighborhood where when I grew up, people used to get that institutional peanut butter that came in a can, and you had to take the can off and it had this oil on top, and you had to stir the oil, or literally you'd get the margarine and you have to put the color into the butter. People know when you're giving them an inferior product. I grew up in those communities. We didn't want it then. We'd rather go get Land O'Lakes. We'd rather go get Skippy. But when you give people inferior product, don't be surprised when they won't use it. It's just human nature.
Let's go to Kelly. You've focused. Canada has more rural space than the United States does, and so you've spent a lot of time thinking about what build out should look like there and how to encourage it and who doesn't have it. Tell us a little bit about what Canada has done and how well it's worked or hasn't worked.
Thank you, Scott. So just a little bit about me in Canada. I am a nonpartisan representative. I am the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, but I support a minister who's responsible for rural economic development. So in my nonpartisan role, we are looking at kind of connectivity, and Canada launched its first connectivity strategy looking at these issues last June. And by far and wide, and you talked about different parties having different views, the number one issue for rural Canadians, and that's about 20% of our population, so it's certainly not insignificant, is connectivity. And connectivity, and I agree, comes in from both. You have to have access. You can't actually have any affordability if you can't even access, digital infrastructure. So as well as the skills to be able to use it. So all of those look into kind of how do we make sure that all Canadians can avail themselves of technology for whatever purposes. And it came loud and wide. That was before the pandemic. And now as we're looking in, I'm working at home right now. I'm in Ottawa. I live in rural Ottawa. And just beforehand, my internet went down and was using a hotspot for my wireless. So we're living in this digital world, very predominantly wanting to use technology. So its import has increased significantly, and there's loud voices from all Canadians to be able to make sure that they have the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure they need to work, to do education, e-health. And for our rural Canadians, who are about 40% of our Canadians in rural and remote Canada have access to 5010 and above, where that is, much, much higher for urban Canadians. Well, we all have it. We have in much higher speeds available to us. So how do we, close that gap? Is that the government is putting, the federal government, the national government, about just over $5 billion. And I know you've talked about putting billions and billions. We'll just calibrate for Canadian kind of standards to be able to close that gap, but doing it in partnership with our private sector ISPs, with our subnational governments, and to be able to bring that in a way that it is affordable, and also concentrating on the skills. So we have other programs that we're using to be able to advance in partnership with ISPs of giving $10 access to broadband, or computers. We have a program called Computers for Schools, where we give hardware out to low-income families. So there's a number of different solutions that are out there. And you're right, we do need to close this gap very quickly. And I don't think that there's a magic bullet, but we do have to kind of concentrate on all three aspects, whether access, skills use, and affordability, to be able to address the needs, given the importance of how we live and work today. So I'll close it at that point.
Well, also, let me ask, what are the mechanisms by which the Canadian government subsidizes broadband?
So from the federal government, it's mainly been granting programs. Mm-hmm. So a few years ago, we had a particular program, 300 million, Connecting Canadians, which was all about last mile. So, and it was a time-limited program, oversubscribed. The need is much greater than the 300 million. So then we did a following program, which was Connect to Innovate, which was about bringing pipes to institutions within our rural and remote communities, so that could have offshoots to get to last mile. And now, last year, within the federal government, they've launched a connectivity strategy, where I mentioned it was just about over $5 billion. And so 1.7 billion will be about getting to Canadians, and we'll be launching that program shortly in a mixture of different ways of doing connectivity, including looking at lower Earth orbital satellites. We know that in Canada, given our geography, that satellite will be one of the solutions, and looking at kind of what the mixture is. And we also have something called the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is a new institution that we've stood up to look at alternative financing models for having infrastructure built within the country. And they're going to be devoting about $3 billion of their funding to be able to work with private sector partners to be able to bring digital infrastructure to Canadians in a way that's different than just pure granting. So in the past, that's certainly the way that we've looked at it. And now we want to look at it through a mixture of different, federal programs.
Are you finding now in Canada the same kind of very public debate about digital divide that we're having here?
We are. I mentioned, supporting the Minister for Rural Economic Development before the pandemic, and we did consultations across the country. And by far and wide, the number one issue was broadband plus. It could be broadband plus housing, broadband plus something else, but it was a fundamental need to be able to move on how to live and work in society today. So, and now with the pandemic, it certainly has augmented, that need, in seeing, I'm working from home today. If you're in rural Canada and my daughter is going to university in a bedroom down the hall, so you can't do that in rural Canada. So that need and that dispersion between what you can do in urban Canada versus rural Canada is certainly much more predominant. And there are very loud voices right now asking for that to change. And that's where the government has launched the over $5 billion to look at how do we do that? How do we partner differently? We have subnational governments who are also investing in the digital divide, and how to advance and close that gap. And the government is committed to doing that by 2030 at this point in time. And we had a political, what we call speech from the throne from our Prime Minister just a few weeks ago. And they had announced that they were going to accelerate and be more ambitious in their targets. So that has yet to be announced, the details of that, but it's certainly taken on a very important feature in how we look at public policy and what we need to do about it right now.
So one more quick question, because we're going to come back to the speed debate that Larry and Greg started, because the answer to that, of course, has a big effect on how much money we will need to spend. So does Canada have a speed threshold? Has the CRT set thresholds that it considers broadband or not broadband?
So what we've said in the connectivity strategy, that all Canadians will have access to 5010 by 2030. And that's up from 5.1 from just 6 years ago.
And to receive subsidies, is there any minimum performance level that's required?
So it would be the 5010.
5010 to receive subsidies.
Yeah, and they look at scalability, robustness, redundancy. There'd be a number of criteria depending on the program that would be evaluated. And mapping, I know you mentioned mapping before. That's another area that's been really important. We were using quite wide hexagons to understand kind of who's served and underserved, and now getting much more granular and public about it to the point where it's almost to the exact house.
I think that's what we're hopefully working on now. Let's go to Judith. Judith, you've spent a long time studying the role of public programs versus subsidies and market forces to expand services to low-income populations. And Mexico is not, exactly comparable to the U.S., but you've tried lots of different programs and looked at different outcomes, and those certainly have lessons. What have you tended to find? I think you need to unmute. It's a key part of every Zoom session, is that somebody needs to unmute.
Good idea. Thank you. Unfortunately, none of them have reached even something close to their original objectives. And while I'll hear looking at in the US and Canada, there has been money spent, not enough, and certainly not efficiently. But it is a different context in the sense of it hasn't even been a priority. As you know, even though market has expanded, there's been growth and a virtuous cycle of ICT adoptions, specifically wireless. Greg was mentioning wireless. I mean, wireless broadband is the way to go. Even in the very lower segments of the population, people are using internet with devices that they're not smartphones, but they are using it. Today, what we see though is that that is not enough. And we can go through the various lists of programs. I think that the most recent one is the broadband plans, where the states, through sort of a changing the pendulum, where before in the 1990s, it was a market that was supposed to create this deployment and get to most of the population. The state sort of came back in through the wireless to the wholesale networks, or the wireless broadband in most countries in Latin America. And these started in 2010, around 2010. And also there's a variety of reasons of why they started. One of them, an important one, as you mentioned now, it's the awareness that access to ICTs is an important policy issue. But 10 years later, we find these, again, have not worked, have not reached even in the case of Mexico, for example, the mandate was to reach 98% of the population by 2022. It hasn't. We're like in 50. That wholesale network, Red Compartida, is just really way below its original obligations, and basically has become a redundant network. So
it's worth, actually, if I could interrupt for a second, telling people a little bit about Red Compartida, because wholesale networks are something that come up here frequently, but we don't do in major ways. And of course, Red Compartida has lots of aspects that have made it controversial, but you've done a lot of work on it. You've studied it. So tell us a little more about that.
The 2013 reform in telecommunications in Mexico mandated the creation of 2 wholesale networks. One of them is a wireless broadband network, and the other one is the fixed broadband network. The fixed broadband network hasn't even been launched yet. The wireless one, which is a wholesale called Red Compartida, what it did begin, it was auctioned. There was only one bidder, and the business model was not well designed. It's actually very depressing. There's been a lot of money spent, and mostly what the government did, it's a PPI partnership with government, and government what did was give them all of the spectrum. They have a 700 bandwidth spectrum, whereas in other countries they sold it and they're actually deploying it. They're using it. In Mexico, they just gave it to this network, and the network hasn't reached nearly close to what they were thinking. So the spectrum hasn't even been used, and moreover, it sort of replaced any other possible program. And here again, just to mention something that you were saying earlier, what would be the role in this case of market versus government? What we've seen in Latin America is that what really expanded is the wireless phenomena in all of the global South is really a market mechanism, which was the prepaid. That's how most of the world got connected, even in rural Africa, in the most remote areas. And if you compare that to any of the programs, it's really prepaid that has done the trick.
Do you think that has lessons for broadband too? Are you saying that you think prepaid would be one thing that should be emphasized more?
Yes, well, broadband is a different animal,
right.
as we know. But I do think that the market has a lot to do yet. Where this may be different in other countries. I mean, I'm sure there's certainly regulatory issues that could be improved in developed countries, but in developing countries, simply spectrum, put the spectrum in the market. There's not enough spectrum in the market. And right now, what we do see is that companies are taking up the role of government during this pandemic. They are using different strategies in terms of lowering prices, in terms of asking for more spectrum, and not getting people off the line that cannot afford it. And I know this is temporary, but I think there's lessons to be learned when we go back to normality, whenever that would be. Because it's terrible. It really is. In the numbers you're mentioning right now, as in average in Latin America, there's like 66% in the region that have no access. And in terms of online schooling, if you look at elementary school, for example, in the numbers of children from 5 to 12-year-olds, it's just 46% of the region that can do that. They're using television, which is really not a good device either. So yes, health and education is really going to create, the digital divide is going to create a much greater economic and social divide, unfortunately.
God, that's depressing. Ceri, you've worked in a lot of the world, from some of the poorest countries and now the UK. What initiatives, public or private, have you seen that struck you as particularly, either innovative or ridiculous? What's really struck you in your experiences?
Thanks very much, Scott, for the opportunity to join. Yeah, as you said, I've been working in this space of connectivity for about the last 10 years as a spectrum policy advisor in Africa for the GSMA. I was at Ofcom for a few years, where I led on the universal service obligation design here. And I now am in a role where I'm looking at how we measure, what people are actually experiencing when it comes to their broadband. I should caveat that with this is almost exclusively in the mobile context, so I probably won't touch a whole lot on fixed. I think there are a huge number of very depressing examples of where policy really hasn't worked. I'm really glad that Judith pointed to single wholesale networks. I think, there was a lot of hype around SWNs at one point a couple years ago, and we've just not seen them deliver. There are a few countries in Africa that have tried them as well, and unfortunately, it's just meant that the services aren't accessible to people because the price point isn't there, because the operators can't control their own investments, and the kind of down the chain, the consumer is who ends up paying for it. Really important here is that we also just split this out when we talk about the digital divide. I think there's a lot that's getting kind of convoluted here, but to me, it's quite helpful to look at the coverage gap versus the kind of, so you have like 600 people around the world who have kind of no access to infrastructure in terms of coverage. And we know that disproportionately affects women. We know it disproportionately affects people in many parts of the global south. So sub-Saharan Africa, 25% of the population is not even able to access that infrastructure, versus North America, it's something like 1%. That's very, very different from the usage gap. So we've got 600 million people without access to infrastructure. We've got 3.4 billion people who have access to that infrastructure, but for some reason, they're not online. And I think a number of people have touched on a couple different reasons why that might be. Affordability is a huge one. We also need to consider things like digital skills, affordable devices. Are the services that people are being marketed, are they relevant to them? Are they in their local language? Are they, in any way driving adoption? And there are also a huge number of underlying enablers that then also create huge barriers to people accessing those services. So can people access identity? Can they even get a SIM card in many parts of the world? Because if they don't have an ID, then they can't access an identity. Or they can't access a SIM card because they don't have an ID. Is there electrification in some of these rural areas? It's costing operators 2 times as much in many instances to run a generator in rural Nigeria and keep a base station going. That is going to pass on this cost to consumers. It's going to impact affordability. It's all connected. So I think when we look at public policy issues, it often, and from what I've seen in the US and to a degree in the UK, we focus so much on the access challenge and not always on the usage gap is really, where we see the huge bulk of the global population is being massively left behind. There are obviously issues in terms of the infrastructure side of things. I think we've seen some really great innovations on from a number of different countries. France is trying some really interesting policy approaches to addressing coverage right now. They have a national kind of holistic joined up plan. They're looking at how they can use spectrum renewal licenses and how they can help work with the operators to kind of use that as almost a subsidy. Tunisia has done really impressive things with their USF, and USFs in general, we know, don't work. They're usually not very well designed, and their kind of money goes vanishing walkies, as they say here. So I think we do have a huge number of interesting cases that are working, but the majority of them are joined up, and they're not just trying to tackle the infrastructure challenge. They're looking at, okay, holistically, how is this all working together? I think the US is a very unique environment. You do have a significant poor rural population, and I think there are many kind of solutions that actually we could look at. Many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, how they're trying to get more people online, and the incremental prepay model, that is when mobile technology took off in sub-Saharan Africa, because it meant that people could incrementally afford access to this technology instead of having an outright plan. And many people don't have any ability to prove that they can pay for those plans. It's all connected. So if you don't have an access to a bank account, you don't have access to an ID, then you can't prove that you can pay for this, and that's going to keep this adoption down. So I think we really, I know that's a big challenge to put out there, but I think we really do need to have some joined up policy going on here. This is not a matter just for the FCC. This is something that involves all elements of understanding access to services in general. And then we need to kind of look at how that fits in with the technology challenges as well. And on the infrastructure side, really promote voluntary infrastructure sharing. There's some great work that's being done. So
I know it's been a while since you've been at Ofcom. So obviously you can't speak for them. But in the UK, where I imagine the digital divide problem is more an income-based than a location-based one, although I could be wrong, so correct me if I am. What sorts of things has Ofcom or other parts of the British government done to bring low-income people online?
Yeah, so I think as with the US, there are a number of kind of digital literacy training programs that the UK government runs. As you mentioned, I haven't been at Ofcom for a number of years now, so I absolutely I cannot speak on behalf of them. There is still quite a rural challenge here, though, as well. But again, we see a number of people who have access to the internet. They could get fixed line internet, and they're not adopting it for a variety of reasons. We have a significant, older population here for whom, they don't really see a use for it in many cases. But I think that from a policy perspective, when we were looking at designing the broadband USO, this is a fixed line USO, we really had to be clear on the public investment that was potentially going to be put forward for this, and the services that people actually needed. And someone mentioned earlier, I know there have been a number of different upload download speed thresholds thrown around, but when we're talking about why someone would adopt this technology, why they will come online, we really need to start looking at what services are they trying to access and what do they really need? Because your average layperson in this country, they don't understand upload download. They don't care what latency is. They have no idea. They want to be able to stream a YouTube video at an affordable price wherever they are in the country. That's really all they care about. So I think from a data perspective, how we're informing these policies, we really do need to be moving away from this obsession with speed, quite frankly, and looking towards kind of a more experiential model where we're trying to understand what are consumers trying to access. You know, what does your average low-income consumer, what kind of content are they trying to access? And what do they need? You know, how do we measure what that experience is like for them at a device level? And I think, I've gone off topic a little bit, but I think when we talk about affordability, it's the value to the consumer. And Larry mentioned this earlier, people know when they're getting an inferior service. So the affordability question also goes back to how we measure what people are receiving.
So that is a great segue into the data. We don't have to talk about data here. We should go to some audience questions in a second. But Larry, let's go back to you. Ceri mentions that some of the information we should collect should be experiential, and you mentioned the sort of lack of good data at the time when you first started looking at it, and now there is a big effort to update our data collection. What should we be looking at? What are the key things to collect that we are not collecting?
Domestically or internationally?
Domestically.
You know, almost everything Ceri said, please, can I put a little star next to it? I'm not, everybody said important things, but a lot of the things that she's talked about, relevance has been something that's been going on for as long as I can remember. I was a consultant for AOL, and I became a consultant for AOL because I told them that they were marketing these products for people other than the growth opportunities they had in Black and brown markets. A little known fact, I tried to start a competitor with Magic Johnson to AOL back in 1999 and 2000 because AOL wasn't marketing their services in a way that seemed culturally relevant to young people, to people of color, to communities that didn't want the static, boring AOL type service. Unfortunately, we had a market recession and our little .com went away. But my point is, you need to reach people where they are instead of where you want them to be. And it was the exact same problem I had when folks were saying you need a laptop in every backpack. You know, as I've said, and Greg's heard me say this before, if you took a laptop in every backpack in the inner city New York where I grew up, you're going to get a lot of kids are beat down and a lot of kids who would have a laptop on Monday who wouldn't have one on Wednesday. So let's try to think about these things in a way that's not from ivory towers, not from theoretical, but let's talk to people, meet them where they are, and find out what their real needs are. Consumers will tell you, and poor people are probably the most discerning consumers we have in America. I don't know about the rest of the world. Unfortunately, we never treat them as if they're intelligent or discerning or know what their needs are. We do it top down. Somebody in Washington or somebody in Albany says, here's what you're going to get, instead of reaching out to these communities and really doing some due diligence as to what do you need. And that's the kind of data I'd like to see a more of an informed analysis of what consumers think they need, as opposed to what governments or private sectors providers think they want to give them. And generally private sector providers, it's what do I want to give you that doesn't distort my existing marketplace, as opposed to what do I want to give you that's going to help you with the life you want to live.
So having done a lot of research on broadband on demand and what people actually want, that rings true to me. Greg, you were about to say something.
I was going to say, I think Larry's going to be upset with this when I say that he's in absolute agreement with economists. If we were designing a universal service system, we would give vouchers to people so that they could then make these informed choices of what they want, what they need. And you said that I'm going to maybe take out of context that low-income people don't want inferior products, but there are all sorts of products where there are different gradations in quality. You'll recall that the former chairman of the FCC said there was a Mercedes divide. You know, not the most sensitive thing to say, but people do buy different qualities of things and they buy what they need. And that's why giving people vouchers, somebody may decide they want mobile because they're never home, but they want to check broadband while they're on the move. Other people may want fixed. And then it was sort of interesting what Ceri talked about and Judith talked about prepaid. This is something where I wrote a paper several years ago about LinkUp, the companion to your Lifeline program. LinkUp.
I was involved in that too.
So, okay, good. You're going to be amazed at how much we agree, Larry.
No, I mean, you and I agree on this. I think if you gave people $20, $25, $30 a month and said, use this to get the service you want, and then you had the private sector competing for those dollars, you'd get better services at better prices, and consumers and the carriers would be happy. Instead, we give $9.25, which is inadequate for anything, and say this is what you're going to get. No one's happy with that. And so I have been working with a number of people on rethinking the Lifeline program. It's a 30-year-old program, and I think we've had like a 3% if you do the compounding. Since when you look at the original Lifeline that I helped create in 1984, 85, and take it to 2000, whatever we're in now, there's been almost no increase in the price and no increase in the we've now allowed you to have either a bad cell phone or bad wireless wireline, or maybe adequate wireline telephone service to your home. What problem is that solving? And that's the other thing I'll go back to because I'm talking too much, Scott. We need to start thinking, what problem are we trying to solve? And that's what Ceri and Judith, I think, said so eloquently. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And we get it. We have not talked at all about the affordability of devices. And I'm talking to a whole bunch of folks who are showing me, you got to work a year in Haiti to get a cell phone. Well, that doesn't, how does that, we can do all we want. If you can't afford the device, we're not solving the problem people have. And it's not just Haiti. There are other countries around the globe that have similar problems. We're not looking at this holistically. We're not drilling down. We're not making informed choices. We're doing it top down, scattershot, and unfocused. And it makes me a little crazy, if you can probably tell from how fast I'm talking.
Let me actually ask one of the questions from the audience and expand it a little bit, because I think it goes to what you're saying. The question is, why hasn't broadband been included in the SNAP program? That's the food stamp program. Lifeline is starting to use SNAP database for verification. Why not integrate it? So, I mean, the broader question then is, why do we not look at it holistically? What's blocking that? I mean, sort of while you're thinking about that, I think we have a tendency to not use evidence to make these kinds of decisions. Greg, you did your paper on Lifeline and LinkUp and found that LinkUp was really effective. So the first thing policymakers did was get rid of it.
It was within a month. We were really effective.
Right. So, I mean, this is kind of a ridiculous question, but, why don't we integrate these things? Why are we not able to sort of think about this holistically?
So, while other people are thinking of good answers to this, I'm going to take about what evidence-based things. Ceri works at Opensignal, and my understanding is that Opensignal has great data on where there is cell phone coverage and not, and probably what speeds everybody has. What are by carrier? Other carriers have this. Google Maps has this almost assuredly. Yet the FCC doesn't take this into account when it figures out what availability there is. And it seems like that's the kind of thing that we need data in order to put these things together and understand where, this is moving away from the low income and moving towards the access point. As where is that? Why doesn't the FCC use this kind of data to have much better than their current Form 477 data and try to use it for evidence-based policymaking?
I guess also not just the FCC, but a question to the others: do other countries use that kind of data from providers?
So how about I'll just join in from Canada's perspective. Certainly, mapping has been an area of importance, and we are now using that information, quite judiciously to understand who's served and unserved. Who are the service providers? And we actually have, if you put your postal code into our interactive map, you can tell who your service providers are and what service is provided in your area, and trying to make it easier for consumers, as well as for our perspective, understanding where investment needs to be made on the access file. So data has been something that we've been trying to get better at in using in policy making overall. And it's certainly been an issue over time. And I think the access one is something that we've been able to advance a lot more on than some of the more complex issues, such as usage and relevance, and why people are using the internet or why they are not. Because if we look at the highest quartile income Canadians, 98% of them have access to the internet, where only 2/3 of our lowest quartile have access to the internet. And it's affordability is certainly one issue, but relevance and use in skill to be able to use it in your day in life is another. And we have to have better information on that. And then policy solutions. So I agree wholeheartedly with a number of the comments that were made on understanding from not from on high, but from a local perspective of what is important for a particular area. And if we're looking in Canada overall, the geography is tremendous, and the needs for a coastal community for internet where they might have a fishing industry might be very different than our prairies where they need precision farming. So how do we look at that differently to make sure that we've got the solutions to be able to provide the lifestyle that's needed in those areas and those geographies? And data is at the heart of it. So I'll leave it there.
Sorry, Scott, just because this is really a striking difference from developing countries when you're speaking about relevance. People from the lowest income level spend 10 to 15% of their income in ICT. So what do you mean? Relevance is obvious in the need to communicate. And today, when we're in the midst of this online education, talking about relevance, I understand, maybe we need to go back to talking about relevance, but right now we really need to be talking about access and adoption and all these other things. And just a brief point here is how important when several of us have mentioned holistic, what do you mean? I think we're talking about institutional strengthening, but a lot about collaboration between interagencies, intergovernmental agencies, and public-private sectors. This collaboration and understanding of what the problem is, because this is, as we know, transversal to all of the sectors, education, health, and so on. It's really thinking of a digital agenda, and I think that's the role of government, to bring people together. Anyway, yeah, relevance seems to, not a problem right now.
So that's oh, sorry, go ahead, Larry.
I'm just going to piggyback. I don't think there's a parent on the planet. I don't think there's a son of an elderly parent or a daughter of an elderly parent right now who doesn't understand the relevance during the middle of this pandemic. I mean, I get to talk to my mom, via FaceTime or whatever, a couple of times a week if I want to. And I think of the 27% of senior citizens in America who don't have that opportunity. But I want to, with regard to the interagency, the biggest problem why we don't have the kind of holistic solutions in across the government because of the siloed, not just the agencies, but congressional committees, so that everybody's doing their thing and there's no kind of coordinated effort. One of the great things about the early days of the internet, with only 15 million people on the internet, was that Al Gore and Bill Clinton created this interagency task force. Ron Brown ran it, and we started talking about how can we do things together to drive the internet into American society and then globally. As we got to 100 million or 500 million or 400 or a billion, whatever it was, that went away. So now you've got Agriculture Department doing its thing, and State Department doing its thing, and Education doing its thing, and the FCC doing its thing, Commerce doing its thing, and they kind of talk to each other, but there's no coordinated opportunity at the top. And I would hope that we'd rethink that. ICT, as they call it globally, in the internet, as we call it colloquially in the United States, is important to everything we do as a nation, and yet we have all these little things going on, all of which cost millions of dollars, and none of which is coordinated. How does that possibly make sense? Think of how much more efficient we could be if we at least had conversations about what are the problems we're trying to solve, who's trying to solve it, and how do we work together? Not to slash programs, but to make them work better, more efficiently, and more cooperatively. And we don't do that.
Are there examples of when something like that worked well? Either when you started it, you talked about
When we started, we had, I mean, every department in the U.S. federal government met monthly under the aegis of Ron Brown to talk about what they were doing with the internet and how they were promoting it and how they're going to use the internet to solve their customers' quote unquote problems at their agency. It went on for about 5 or 6 years. It ended when the Clinton administration ended, or I don't know, I left. So maybe before I left in '99, but it was still going on into the Daley administration. And we still need that kind of cooperative, thoughtful approach to these kinds of issues. Otherwise, we're going to waste billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of hours and still not solve some of the problems we need to solve.
I just point to 2 countries that have actually done quite a good job at this. The Rwandan government, actually, their minister of ICT, he's not just their minister of ICT, he's the minister of ICT and youth. And I think that's a really important designation that they gave him, because he is in charge of kind of everything from youth employment through to, I mean, he was one of the people that led on the single wholesale network, but through to the digital policy. Also, the Zambian government has a national office of digitization that sits within the president's office. They are responsible for coordinating all digitization, kind of any programming, any policy throughout Zambia. It has to go through them, and that can be a bottleneck. But I think at the same time, because they have that visibility at the executive level, they are able to move things through, and you don't get these kind of things that get stuck in various committees. So again, I would say, I know it's not always the most obvious thought, but looking to some other countries outside the U.S., they've had to act holistically on this, because they've completely leapfrogged fixed, and they've had to create policies and regulations from scratch that work. So I would just point to those 2.
When maybe I can add, from Canadians' perspective, from the national government, there has been a number of different departments and agencies funding access. And recently, with our connectivity strategy, we've put in a no wrong door. So there's one portal, one way of coming in. We have to coordinate amongst ourselves. The application is shared, so we understand, because each of our tools can have different cost sharing grants. So looking at kind of what the business case and what the right solution is, as well as working with our subnational governments from a governance strategy. So we're all aligned, so we don't go from our national government to our provincial governments with different programmings, and even aligning applications with our subnational government. So it is moving kind of in the right direction, and trying to get away from that siloed approach to make sure we're not making it complex, especially when we're looking at rural and remote Canada, because those communities might have 5 people working in their municipalities. So they don't have the sophistication, the capacity to kind of reach up and figure out what we need. So how do we support that better and make it a lot easier for our rural population to be able to avail themselves even of the programs that we're offering? So that is another kind of area that we are focusing on.
So let me ask you, sorry, go ahead, Larry.
Folks like Tom Khalil working in the the Obama and Clinton administrations, who's served a coordinating role. We had a few people in Vice President Gore's office. It doesn't necessarily have to be, moving chairs around. If you had a focused attention to what's going on and how money was being spent by 1 or 2 people who really understood the problem and were creative, you could do amazing things. Unfortunately, it's been in fits and starts in our country. And I would hope this pandemic will focus us on the needs in America to really have a digital strategy, particularly with regard to getting these digital tools in the hands of as many people who need it. And I haven't seen any, I don't think you can do it just at the FCC or just at Ed or just at Ag, but there's billions of dollars between them. And I don't see the level of coordination, focus, and attention that's needed given the severity of the problem.
So let me ask a slightly obnoxious question, but isn't there a risk that if you try to coordinate at that level, you end up losing even more of the bottom-up approach, which we don't have enough of right now?
It's absolutely a risk, but it's probably a risk worth taking, because what you have right now are 4 or 5 different fiefdoms, different congressional committees with their priorities. So instead of, when you have a bunch of priorities, you have no priority. And right now what we have is a bunch of priorities. So we have effectively no priority.
And do you think that the problem is with in this area in particular is worse than others, or is it partly a symptom of this administration's inability to focus on anything?
Yes and yes.
Okay. Let's go to.
I agree, and that's also true in other countries.
So actually, I'm going to go into another question. But Judith, let me ask you. So the most recent telecom reform in Mexico was part of the Constitution, which is a weird thing for Americans because we know our Constitution by song, most of us from Schoolhouse Rocks, and we don't think of telecommunications as being part of it. I think Greg is looking like he doesn't have any idea what I'm talking about. But did that at all help bring parts of the government working together, at least at some point?
I think that during that past administration, one thing that worked was precisely what I think Larry was talking about, and Ceri, I believe, that is having an office in the presidency at the highest level was important in doing some things, getting health to rural women, also working with different ministries. Of course, there wasn't enough leadership or collaboration from different agencies, but that part of the reform, I think, was important. Of course, this administration dismantled everything, including the conditional cash programs for these women. From a so-called left government. It's all being dismantled. But one thing that the reform did is diminish concentration a bit. That's what they really put their stakes at, trying to do that, and institution building, which of course, again, is being dismantled, the regulatory agency. But in terms of coverage, it hasn't at all. It's even grown. It's everything of what we said is needed, and the wholesale networks is certainly a huge mistake. It's not even not getting there, but it's competing with private carriers in getting to the same places using federal funding. So neutrality, competition, neutrality, all of is there's just everything. Most of it is wrong.
I was going to start to ask something about net neutrality, but go.
No, we don't.
Larry suggested this is a question from the audience, and it's a good question. I have no idea what the answer is. Maybe somebody does. Larry suggested a $20 to $25 voucher. Do we know what the impact of that on adoption would be? What do we know about elasticities?
I guess that's, I'll jump in for a second. Yeah. One thing that Judith just brought up, which I thought is really important as an economist, and kind of ties to Larry's point about discerning consumers and choice, is the conditional cash transfer programs that Mexico had, right? That was a, basically give cash, and then you can decide whether you want to spend more money on food, more money on rent, more money on broadband internet. And this $20 to $25 voucher would be very much, here, you use this for broadband access however you want to do it. And it's kind of narrowing the scope of what people can spend it on. And it depends, obviously the $20 to $25 voucher would be great for people who have access to Comcast Internet Essentials, because basically they could use it and get service for free. That would be great for them. It would be possible that they may decide they'd rather use it for $35 a month wireless internet, wireless service. But we think that it would increase adoption because, as you said, demand curves go down, and this voucher is essentially shifting the demand curve. So subsidizing the price on the demand curve. So we think that we'll have price go down and adoption go up. We just don't think it's going to go to 100% based on that.
Yeah, I am not an economist. I don't play one. I actually would have said $25 to $40, but I do think if you gave a significant voucher for quality service, you would see quality of service improve. You'd see the number of vendors who are competing for that service improve, and I think you'd see adoption rates go up. I certainly think at a time when we're looking at tens of millions of children who don't have access to school and millions of seniors who don't have access to basics, as well as some working poor, or folks having to make a choice under the existing lifeline for either internet essentials or a cell phone or a wireline, and per household, not per family, per household. So that means grandma, kids, and family all get that same $9.25 if they live in the same house. That's a ludicrously insufficient subsidy. So I think if we increase that subsidy and had and put some baselines as to what could actually be subsidized, you'd start seeing some competition for that dollar. And I do think you'd see adoption go up. Again, I'm a social scientist, but a poli-scientist, not a economist.
But actually, that's an interesting addition you made to the voucher program, that you wouldn't actually let people decide what they want to buy. You would put a minimum kind of performance on it. And that, of course, makes total sense when we're talking about subsidizing firms to build out. But why would you tell families what the minimum is that they have to purchase with the voucher?
Because I do think that, you know, when you start looking at some of the scams that have run in telecommunications and some of the fraudulent companies, you would want some minimal performance. I mean,
from the perspective of other countries, what do they think about digital divide issues in the U.S.? Do they think that do other countries look at our universal service program, or is it completely irrelevant? Is there anything that we're doing that people think is good enough that they should emulate, I guess, or things that are so bad that they think, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that, and we better not ever do that ourselves?
I love the smile on Ceri's face as you asked that question.
Yeah, right.
I think there's some really, again, on the spectrum side of things, on the auctions, I think there's some really innovative stuff being done on the access side of the question. Right before we got cut off, the one point I did want to make on conditional cash transfers is I think there are two populations we really have to look out for to avoid even marginalizing them. The homeless in the US is critical that whatever CCT program is developed, there's a way that homeless people can access it, because we know they don't have identity, they don't have a fixed address, they don't have a bank account. And also people with disabilities. I think this is something that often gets completely left out of many discussions when we talk about inclusion. So just those two things I would say with CCTs are really important. But from a perspective of a half American that lives outside of the US and has done for 11 years, I think there are a lot of very innovative things that are happening on the access side, and it remains to be seen, what the impact of that will be on coverage. But for me, the affordability question is a really massive issue. And having worked, all over the developing world, this is not a challenge that's unique to the US, but I do think it would be good to look outside what we do in the US and look how other countries have approached it, definitely.
So maybe from Canada's perspective, certainly when I was in my previous job, which was regulating the use of spectrum, we would constantly be in conversations with the FCC, and I know my former organization remains in conversation with the FCC. And as policymakers and advisors to elected officials, we're constantly looking, obviously south of the border of what you're doing, as well as UK, Australia, New Zealand. We look broadly in learning from others and trying to have the approach that's relevant for Canada's context. So. Yes, always looking at what the states are doing. And obviously from a market perspective, especially when it comes to telecommunications, aligning spectrum bands has been something that we've traditionally done, not always. In 2500, we went differently, but because we are a small market and we want affordable devices for Canadians.
So if Judith has one final answer, if Mexico ever looks at the U.S. and thinks that's a universal service program that works, or that's one that's just awful?
There's a universal service program that I think worked better than others, let's say, and I think Colombia and Chile are two good examples of it. And they were flexible in terms of technology. It was open. They used the fund and then, did this auctions, and they were monitored. And I think there was also leadership in the case of Colombia. The minister is very famous. Well, it was probably famous within the Latin American context, Diego Molano. But just his political leadership and conviction, and getting everybody else on board on Vive Digital, which was the program in Colombia, I think was something to follow and to see what happened there. And also Chile. But Chile is also kind of an outlier in Latin America. It, you know, has mostly rule of law and institutions working. But certainly that's part of it.
Okay, thanks so much to everybody. We're going to have to wrap it up there. I really appreciate you all joining for this. I thought it was a great discussion. I wish we could keep going for a lot more time because it's such a big problem. Thank you all so much. We're now going to turn to a conversation led by Brian Sullivan, who is anchor of CNBC's Worldwide Exchange, with Chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai.